When scholars translated the cuneiform text of the diorite stele unearthed at Susa in 1901, the modern world came across the most complete legal code in the ancient Near East, the Code of Hammurabi. The law code was famous for its principle of retributive justice, such as the phrase an eye for an eye, which is still accepted to some extent in the modern world. However, there are also some aspects in Hammurabi's laws that are incompatible with modern ideology, such as its extensive regulations governing debt. Unlike contemporary legal frameworks that favor creditors, Hammurabi's laws impose severe restrictions on creditor activity, periodically cancelled agrarian debts entirely, and treated the accumulation of debts as a threat to social stability rather than a private matter of property right. For example, a Babylonian named Lelam once wrote to Hammurabi that a creditor came to a certain land which Lelam had held from long ago and took the crop, although the land was not his. Since creditors taking crops from debtor's field was strictly forbidden in Hammurabi's laws, and palace records confirmed Lelam's title, the creditor was condemned to not only return the crop, but also forfeit the money he advanced. Scholars and economists have been perplexed by such regulations. They asked why would anyone be willing to lend if they knew that their claim would be so easily erased? Wouldn't the prospect of debt cancellation dry up credit and disrupt economic activity? These questions are anachronistic because most agrarian debts in Babylon didn't come from voluntary lending by private creditors. Instead, they arose from unpaid bills for daily production and consumption, fees and taxes owed to the palace for irrigation water, seeds, and other agricultural inputs. Bills run up at local alehouses to be settled at harvest time on the threshing floor. However, when war, drought, or other crises disrupted agricultural production, cultivators wouldn't be able to pay their debts. The palace collectors and private creditors would then seize control of their land and reduce their families to debt bondage. This was when social stability began to collapse. Babylonian society were faced with this issue during the reign of Hammurabi. Hammurabi governed southern Mesopotamia by delegating power to fellow Amorite chieftains who transformed their local temple offices into hereditary positions and engaged in tax farming at the crown's expense. These local elites become the primary creditors within their respective communities. Apart from their usury, the declining soil quality, the overcrowding of arable land, and the burdens of imperial taxation all led to ever larger segments of the population unable to meet their debt obligations. When farmers lost their land and were reduced to bondage, they could no longer provide corvée labor, military service, and crop surpluses to the palace. To address these problems, Hammurabi employed two complementary mechanisms, his famous law code and his periodic mīšarum proclamations. The mīšarum tradition was central to Babylonian politics. Derived from a Semitic root meaning to go straight or to be in order, mīšarum referred specifically to timely interventions to address civil dislocations. In practice, this meant cancelling agrarian debts, returning foreclosed lands to their original cultivators, and freeing debtors from bondage. Hammurabi himself issued a mīšarum announcement upon his accession in 1792 BC, and again in 1780, 1771, and 1762 after he defeated Rim-Sin of Larsa. Not just Hammurabi, 6 successive kings of the Babylonian dynasty declared mīšarums during a 166-year span. These edicts were symbolically expressed as breaking the clay tablets on which debt obligations were recorded. They were conceived by Babylonians not as radical reforms, but as restorative acts that returned society to its divinely ordained equilibrium. Hammurabi inscribed his laws late in his reign around 1754 BC. The epilogue states his philosophy with moral clarity. He inscribed his law so that the strong shall not oppress the weak, to provide just ways for the waif and the widow, and to provide just ways for the wronged. The text explicitly invited any wronged person to come before a statue of Hammurabi and have the law read aloud so that it could help resolve his issue. Addressing the accumulation of debts, the law code aimed to ban creditors' aggressive crop seizure, prevent land privatization, and limit the practice of debt bondage. Hammurabi converted clan-tenured land throughout southern Mesopotamia into inalienable royal properties, which he leased to soldiers and cultivators. Law 37 nullified sales of rural fields, orchards, or homes owned by soldiers, commissaries, or feudatories. It declared any deeds to buyers null and void, ordered buyers to forfeit all monies, and return the property to its original owner. Law 38 went farther. It prohibited soldiers and feudatory tenants from transferring ownership of their fields, orchards, or homes either to wives or daughters or pledging them as collateral. Law 41 reinforced these restrictions by stating that if a creditor foreclosed on any such property, the debtor could reclaim them without paying his debt. Land in Bronze Age societies was not personal property in the modern sense. It carried public obligations, including taxes, rents, military service, and corvée labor. It is a reservoir of social labor that could not be allowed to fall into private hands. Hammurabi also restricted creditors' ability to take possession of debtors' crops. Laws 49 to 50 stated that only the owner of a field could harvest the grain, not his creditor. It meant that the debtor must fulfill his obligations to the palace first, only then may they pay private creditors. Creditors were forbidden even to accept a debtor's invitation to enter his land and harvest his crop. If they did so, they had to return whatever they had taken and forfeit their entire claim. Law 51 authorized debtors to repay the loan in commodities of equivalent value in accordance with the price ratio fixed by the ruler. Thusly, cultivators could avoid selling their crops at distressed prices for silver. Law 241 acknowledged that critical production assets like oxen could not be taken as pledges, since they were needed for debtors to work them out of debt. The code further restricted the practice of debt bondage, which became widespread in the first half of the second millennium BC. People pledge family members as security for back taxes or loans, sell them to pay outstanding debts, or simply to ensure their physical survival in troubled times. To curb this practice, Hammurabi ruled that unpayable debts resulting from acts of God, such as pests, storms, drought, or epidemic, were not enforceable. Law 48 granted debt amnesty to cultivators whose crops failed due to natural disasters. Law 249 stated that if a man rented an ox, which was struck down by God, he should be released from liability. Law 266 afforded similar protection if cattle were eaten by lions or killed by disease. Law 93 penalized predatory creditors. Any creditor who charged compound interest or collected partial payments without issuing new contracts were fined double the amount of money they received. Law 116 penalized cruel treatment of bondservants. If a servant died by beating or abuse, the penalty against the creditor would reflect the status of the deceased. For example, if the deceased was the debtor's son, the creditor's own son would be put to death. Law 117 placed strict limits on debt servitude. Wives, daughters, or sons pledged to creditors would go free once they have served for 3 years. Overall, Hammurabi's laws demonstrate a philosophy of law as deterrent rather than simply a regulatory mechanism. Some modern scholars have criticized Hammurabi's punishments as excessive. For instance, rather than stripping away the entire claim from a creditor who wrongfully seized crops, making him forfeit the illegal portion seem fairer. Criticisms like this fail to understand the Bronze Age approach to justice, in which punishment served simultaneously to deter abuse and provide restitution to the injured party. As New York State Attorney General Robert Abrams noted, most ancient civilizations integrated restitution with punishment, including Babylonians, Greeks, Romans, Germanic tribes, and Hebrews. For example, the Law of Moses commanded 4-fold restitution for stolen sheep and 5-fold for an ox. In Babylonian law, creditors' forfeitures were not fines paid to the state, but rather a transfer of wealth to the victim. The historical trajectory that followed demonstrated the significance of Hammurabi's achievement. Bronze Age rulers repeatedly overrode the incipient creditor oligarchy centered in their own bureaucracies, using royal power to prevent the polarization of landholding and the spread of debt bondage. After 1600 BC, however, fading palace power eroded their efforts. By Greek and Roman antiquity, the poor demanded in vain that their debts be cancelled, their family members freed from bondage, and their land tenure restored. Occasionally, these demands spilled over into civil conflict or defection to foreign attackers. But in the end, Greece and Rome shifted the legal balance decisively in favor of creditors. Hammurabi's laws thus stand not as a precursor to modern contract law, but as a fundamentally different vision of economic justice. One in which the stability of the state, the liberty of its citizens, took precedence over creditors' right to extract wealth from the productive base of society. Thank you for watching. I put a lot of work into the research and production of this video, so if you get this far, I would really appreciate it if you could give me a like or subscribe to my channel. Have a good day. I will see you next time.